I'm Benerson Little. I'm the author of several books on piracy, including my first book, which was on the subject of tactics. Former Navy SEAL. Um, I've written some fiction as well. I have consulted on a variety of documentaries. I was Black Sails historical consultant for all four seasons. And I've worked on some video games, tabletop war games as well. And it's something that I started out primarily as a hobby and more or less developed into a very poor means of support.
Yeah, and I think this is especially something which makes you stand out from a lot of part historians, because a lot of part historians they tend to focus on a lot of it's just like the broad history, like biographies. There's also, of course, a lot of focus on the naval aspect, whereas you have more deep dived into the land tactics of the Buccaneers in the 17th century, how they fought.
It's Yeah, one of the early things I noticed when I was doing this was the similarities between some of the things we did in the Navy and some of the things these Buccaneers did, which was semi-conventional, semi-unconventional. I thought it gave me an insight into what they were doing. But also, I was very much, let's say, from a novelist perspective and just someone who's a people watcher. A lot of these historical characters, these Buccaneers, I knew people in the Navy that you could almost see the similar characters. It's almost, I've had a feeling that I knew these people, how they would react. I had seen similar situations, and it gave me a sense of being there. I know that's what we all
Mm.
might want to do is we want to go back into history and we'd like to, I mean, I don't want to live in the 17th century. I wouldn't mind visiting, you know. I like modern medicine.
Yeah.
I like keeping my teeth. I like the fact that I can get surgery and keep going for 20 more years with something that might have crippled me in the 17th century. But since we can't go back, the closest we can do is try to cull through these manuscripts and get the details out of them, but also look at our current circumstances and people that we know who behave similarly and look at similar circumstances. I'm a firm believer that people don't change. They've been, for thousands of years, people are people, that as soon as we learn some of the local culture, you can get along, you can joke with people, you can learn things from them. I mean, we're sitting here on, an ocean between us, and
Yeah.
no,
No, definitely. I think it's really good there that you went into because that is something I wanted to state as well, but you did it for me, how your own experiences have really allowed you to see these sort of like very similar patterns of like how they operated. And of course, that is what the bulk of the discussion is going to concern.
yeah,
But
and
I
that's
think
a good
like,
word. I'm sorry. I just
no,
want to
please.
say that's a good
Yeah.
word, patterns.
Yeah.
I'm a pattern watcher, whether it's in fencing or whatever. You can look through history, you start seeing these patterns. And the more you read in history, or more we're looking at piracy, for example, you start seeing patterns. And then once you see the patterns, you can see when things are missing too, and you can, extrapolate, so to speak, if that makes any sense.
Right. No, no.
I've often guessed that something is missing here, and I think I know the answer because I've seen these patterns before, and it usually turns out to be correct.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is like a lot of the pirate history and Buccaneer history is like very poorly documented, so they don't
Mhm.
provide all of the details. So what you're saying is that like sometimes by having this like background knowledge, you can sort of fill in the gaps and make
Yes,
educated
yes.
guesswork. Yeah.
And we've been very fortunate too, at least as far as Buccaneers goes, that you had a dozen or more men who documented their
Mm.
time with the Buccaneers in detail. So you can cull a lot of these small details, put it together, and extrapolate from there. So we really don't have that in the early 18th century pirates.
Yeah, definitely.
You
But
know,
I'm thinking we're sort of going to start out with a bit of almost like a summary to sort of get things
yeah.
going. So I'm going to ask you about what would you say that are the major differences between Marines and Buccaneers?
Uh, Marines are primarily, as originally intended, were a land force placed at sea. They're essentially to conduct land operations in an amphibious capacity.
Yeah.
You need troops on ships. You want your sailors to do sailing. So you get soldiers, they can provide security. They can make amphibious landings. Historically, a lot of this was done by fighting seamen themselves. And even
Right.
in 17th, 18th, probably even 19th centuries, um, even when Marines were used for these amphibious operations, you would still have armed seamen going along with them. It was quite common. Um, so Marines have primarily had you might say, a conventional amphibious purpose, but they also have been involved in certain unconventional operations, and I would attach to them your naval commandos as well. Because again, they have similar tactics. They tend to do a little bit more special operations, but they're all sea fighters, and some countries today draw their naval commandos from their Marines forces, like in the UK, for example. In the US, they're drawn from the US Navy.
Mm.
But they all have very similar attitudes and very similar purposes. One of the points that I've made in the past is that if you're
Mm.
going to fight on or from the sea, you really need to know something about the sea. You can take conventional army forces and put them at sea, but it really helps if they have experience at sea or they've been brought up and bred to fight at sea, because there are going to be some differences, even if it's just as simple as, being familiar with naval craft that you're going to have to get you ashore. Now, much of that has changed today. Most countries, their Marines are often used to augment in land forces. Naval commandos are used often inland, far away from the sea, in spite of all their naval training. We use, helicopters and things to put them
Yeah.
ashore instead of doing the conventional, put them in boats and landing craft and things like that. But I was fortunate that in the 80s when I served in the Navy as a naval commando, is that we did not have the advantage of a lot of modern technology. We didn't have
Yeah.
GPS. We didn't have a lot of the really, the communications that they have today are far superior, the intelligence, drones, things like that. So in a lot of ways, it's very similar. And, you're still using map and compass to try to find out, so you get lost a lot. You're still using, similar weapons. You don't have the ability to communicate as well, and communications were often down.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, it was very similar. It's wet, it's cold, it's miserable, things don't work. Sand gets in everything. Water is terrible for just about everything. And, it's a difficult environment, to operate in and to fight in.
I would also like for those that aren't too educated on the subject of the Buccaneers, what are the sort of like, what sort of defines them that separates them from the Marines?
Primarily, it's that Buccaneers, like any Sea Rovers, their principal purpose was wealth by force of arms from the sea, is how I've described it. They were not a national force. They might be used by nations for their own purposes, but the Buccaneer was after profit. They wanted to plunder. They were out to make money for themselves. They were not out to score points for the nation. They weren't out there to, they weren't out there for regime change or anything else. If they were tasked as privateers by nation, they still wanted money. That's their driving force. And it changes their tactics in a lot of ways. Although you might say the foundational tactics are similar. For example, a country today might send the Marines in to, for whatever reason, let's say they're going to capture a small island that they don't like the change in government. The Marines are going to go in no matter what. They're going to follow orders. They're going to keep going. Buccaneers go on that, and they're just getting hard knocks, and it doesn't look like they're going to win. They're going to get out of there before they get too many of their people lost. They're just, they're getting out because it's not profitable, and they're going to take off. And this is the reason you see some commentators at the time accusing Buccaneers of cowardice. The Baron de Pontis at 1697 at Cartagena, he had
Yeah.
Buccaneers as an auxiliary force. He couldn't stand them. I mean, he was your classic arrogant French aristocrat, in a military command. So he wasn't going to like these people anyway because they were functionally democratic and, they tended to vote on everything, and they wanted their articles used and, not take the pittance, from the French king. And they had some very good skills. Something common, I think, with both the Buccaneers and, let's say, modern maritime forces like Marines, naval commandos, is they tend to rely very heavily on their marksmanship.
Mm.
They tend to emphasize good shooting, especially not just volume of shots, but they're really looking at aimed shots. That's extremely important in modern naval commandos, where everybody, including the officer, is a shooter, for example, and they're going to try to keep up a constant rate of fire to suppress enemy fire. Buccaneers did the same thing. They could fire volleys, but they rarely did. They essentially got into pairs, one loading, one firing, and they wanted to keep up that same constant volume of fire. Now they didn't invent that. That was you see that even in conventional forces, for example, 17th, 18th century, but it's usually in extremis when conventional forces are doing it. You know, they're backed into a corner and their officer says, no more volley fire. Everybody, they keep up that constant rate of fire, you know,
Yeah.
because you don't want the enemy to slip in between volleys. So they didn't invent it, but they perfected it well. And like I'll credit the Marines with a lot of changes in tactics too, and also naval commandos. And by naval commandos, again, these can be Marines or drawn from the U.S. Navy. They're essentially commandos who operate from the sea.
Hmm.
They tend to be a little bit cutting edge in developing tactics too, a little bit more unconventional. We know that Buccaneers, for example, they loaded earlier than most conventional armies did with a paper cartridge that
Right.
had was
Yeah.
powder and the ball, and it's very
Yeah.
quickly you just bite the end of it off, you prime, you can actually just shove the whole paper cartridge in, ram it down. We know they had a quick loading method, which also other conventional forces used occasionally, but it's probably amounted to biting the head of the cartridge off, taking the ball in the mouth,
Yeah.
priming, pouring the powder in, spitting the ball down, and banging, you know, the musket butt on the ground so the ball would sheet. Now this is dangerous. I don't recommend it. I've tried it, and I always tested to make sure the ball was seated on the powder before I fired it because I didn't want my barrel to blow up. But you know, they could fire very, very quickly, you know, because they know they need to get ahead of the game. They've got to get that suppressing fire down. Um, they liked attacking by surprise. Um, they were great gatherers of intelligence. It's the same thing you
Right.
need for a modern amphibious landing. You really need good intelligence. So there's a lot of similarities that you can find between the two. But again, the defining distinction is one of discipline. Buccaneers could be disciplined when necessary, but they don't have that military discipline that says this is your target, you're going to follow orders, you know. I guess a good example would be World War II, the Pacific, or even in
Mm.
landings in France and Italy.
Right.
You got soldiers who are doing amphibious landings. It doesn't matter what the casualty rate is. They're disciplined and they're going to go and they're going to land and they're going to do everything they can. You get a bunch of Buccaneers doing the same thing, and if they're taking too much fire on the beach, you know, they're bailing out of there because it's not profitable to.
Yeah, and I think also a very that I just consider now a very crucial distinction, and also a bit of a question to you is, of course, the Buccaneers were very multinational. Oftentimes, they, at the most, they would consist of like Englishmen, which is like what is an Englishman back in the day? It's also Irish,
Hmm.
Welsh, Scots,
Hmm.
and then you have Frenchmen, you have Dutchmen. Besides,
Yes.
all of these very tiny nationalities, like you often see, of course, Spanish and Portuguese, or like even people from Italy, the Middle East, Scandinavia.
Yeah, a lot of this, you had Spanish deserters, Portuguese in there
Yeah,
joining them. There are records of a few Asians among the French
yeah,
Buccaneers in the 1680s. They would have come on the Manila galleons across
yeah,
into the Americas, you know, through Mexico and then deserted. African Americans, I
yeah,
guess you could call them African Americans if they were more than one generation. Or anyway, you had black Buccaneers as well, some slaves, some free. But yes, you
a
have
lot
this
of a lot of
very,
Indians
very
as well,
rich.
Native Americans as
Mhm.
well.
Native Americans as well. That you have this rich culture, you
Yeah,
know, which, and again, I'm going to pick on the early 18th century pirates. You don't see nearly as much of that.
yeah.
They're mostly Anglo-American, some French, um, Africans, blacks who are mostly slaves, maybe a few Native Americans in there. It's a very, very completely different culture in a lot of ways.
But I think
Martial
there's
culture was
also
different.
I think there's probably also a good reason because I'm under the impression that a lot of the 18th century pirates they were reasonably well read on the journals of the earlier Buccaneers because you often see that they are very often influenced and impressed by these like earlier
Hmm.
generations. And I think like if you look at the Buccaneers, a lot of their conflicts were based on these international conflicts within the ranks. Like a lot of times the Frenchmen team up against the English and they
Yes.
break off and do mutinies. So do you think this is also like a crucial distinction between the Marines being more like are the Marines more homogeneous and is this like something which contributes to
I,
their
in the
discipline?
U.S. at least, I don't know that I'd say the Marines are more homogenous.
Mm,
Racially and culturally, the Marine Corps is very diverse, and they have a
Hmm.
high percentage, U.S. Marine Corps, and they have a high percentage of black and brown peoples in there. It's always
Yeah,
in the U.S. military. It's much more racially diverse, I think, than the country as a whole.
right.
But what they do have is discipline, so that they're not going to let those differences, make a difference. If you want to get in trouble, I know at least when I was in the military, racism wasn't tolerated because
Right. Yeah.
it's terrible for discipline, and
Yeah.
they would come down on anybody hard for that. You're going to go fight. Possibly this guy's here to save you, and he's got your back. You can't have that kind of indiscipline because if you do, that person's not going to be there, to cover you.
That's something you see in a lot of in some of these early 18th century pirate articles as well, where they say like, "Oh, we completely outlaw. You're gonna have no
Yeah,
religious discussions. You're gonna have no political discussions.
yeah.
Just keep it out of
Hmm.
here. Keep it civil."
You have
Um,
to. And it's something you were talking about, not just the nationalistic distinctions, but you had among the French, you would have religious arguments too among the
yeah,
Buccaneers, between the Huguenots and or Calvinists, as they might call them, and the
yeah,
Catholics. You had a lot of problems there. Also, something I think you see among the Buccaneers, and again, I can't prove this because we don't have enough information on the early 18th century pirates, but you see among the Buccaneers, you see a very vigorous democracy. There was no cult of personality.
right.
And I think once you get in the 18th century pirates, and again, we don't have enough information on them, but there's a sense that there's often a cult of personality. I mean, these are
Yeah.
pirates and they choose Bartholomew Roberts, who knows nothing about sea fighting, and he's a captain and they follow him forever. Some significant differences, I think, in there. In some ways, you might almost argue that democracy could be the Achilles heel for Buccaneers at times.
Hmm.
That Grand South Sea Voyage with Bartholomew Sharp et al.
Yeah.
They were constantly beset by dissension, and they'd have another election. They'd put another captain in, and sometimes it turned into a disaster.
One thing that I wanted to bring up as like also about this the difference in racial and ethnic composition is the issue of language, because the way I understand it is that the Marines and U.S. Armed Forces are
Mhm.
linguistically homogeneous, whereas the Buccaneers must have been. I mean, we know that, they had a lot of languages amongst them, and some spoke Spanish and could communicate with the Spanish. Do you is is this something which exists? Like, are the Marines more linguistically homogeneous, and is that something which allows for better discipline than the Buccaneers, would you say?
That's a very good point. Something I haven't actually considered, and I may have to put it in my errata or notes. Like I publish notes about the books I've written, and I put them up to keep them up
Yeah.
to date. So I will give you credit for that idea. Um, um, Yeah, it does help that everybody speaks the same language. I'm sure in the Roman legions, everybody learned the same language. I suspect that among Buccaneers, there was some kind of lingua franca or pidgin or something that they were learning, and they would pick up snatches of language. And, everybody can learn. I mean, if you go to sea, there's differences, but everybody's going to know the language of the sea, for
Yeah.
example, and they're going to pick that up. But I've often wondered that the same thing myself. Lawrence de Graaf, I mean, he was Dutch. We know he spoke Spanish. We know he spoke French. Did he use multiple languages, in combat, shouting to different parts of his crew? It'd be an interesting test to actually find people who don't have a good grasp of, some of these other languages and see how quickly you can get them working together
Right.
to, for example, fire broadside. That'd be an interesting, maybe we could set that up and do that project sometime.
That sounds like a fun thing. And I have a couple of things to say. For one, about the sort of lingua franca. There is a pretty recent book which I can highly recommend, which I think it was written by a woman called Sally Delgado, which covers she has basically what it's about is about this lingua franca of Caribbean sailors, where she basically argues that they spoke a sort of unique dialect, which was I mean, it was English, but it had like a lot of, she's found evidence that it had a lot of Spanish incorporated into it, and even
Mhm.
things like Spanish speech patterns and stuff like that. Of course, the evidence is vague, especially since we don't have recordings and stuff. But the
Yeah.
primary evidence of that book are, letters from sailors and court transcripts and stuff where, since luckily, uh, they wrote stuff phonetically. So they wrote stuff how they
Yes.
would have pronounced it.
Hmm.
But it's probably something you have seen quite a lot as well in the journals. Like they use a lot of Spanish words. Like which they incorporate into English, like stuff like ambuscade, for example, which is from
Hmm.
Spanish. Or
Yep.
there are probably some good historical and current examples of multilingual forces like the Foreign Legion in Ukraine, for example, where there's a lot of like English people coming in and learning
Yes.
Russian and Ukraine and stuff
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Special operations forces tend to that are at least tasked with certain regions will be required often to pick up a second language. The Army Special Forces, I know, is very, very big on that. We didn't do quite as much. We had, one command that was tasked primarily with Latin America, and they would pick up Spanish. But Buccaneers did. There's a lot of evidence that many of them were polylingual, not
yeah,
just, you know, multi, and many of them could get by well with Spanish. And although, to be honest, the best thing you can do if you're trying to pretend to be Spanish for purpose of deception is to get one of your Spanish crew members. My wife's a Spanish teacher, and she'll
oh yeah,
lecture me all the time on there is no true fluency, and that a second, that unless you're a small child, for example, anytime you learn, no matter how convincing your accent is, a native speaker can probably tell
yeah.
that you're not a native speaker.
We're gonna finish up a bit on that part, and I'm gonna move on to the sort of next point here. And that is basically what these following sort of questions or topics are gonna concern is sort
Mhm.
of go through an operation or like a campaign sort of step by step and sort of see how these different steps compare. So sort of starting out from the beginning, how preparing an expedition, what are the big differences there? Yeah,
Okay, let's use a fairly small operation. For example, let's say it's 50 to 100 men. This will
yeah,
make it a little bit easier. Also kind of focuses it more down on kind of a quick raid or a special operations type of assault. The Buccaneers are going to go assault a small Spanish place. When they're boarding their boat, the first thing they do is that they wax everything down. Cartridge boxes were probably wrapped in oilskin or tarpaulins or something, even if they had sides to keep the rain out. That there's all it takes is one good splash and your
yeah,
powder's you got a problem. So they basically waterproofed everything and they lashed everything down. And that is essentially the same thing even modern forces, maritime forces are going to do. You're going to lash things down the boat for that transit. You're not going to bring your weapons up until you're in a threat zone. And the reason being is if you get capsized in the surf, you've lost your weapons, you've lost your ability to fight. Anybody who thinks you can get dumped in the surf with a weapon in your hand, and if you lose it, you can pick it and find it back up, has never been dumped in the surf before. You're never going to find those things. And the Buccaneers knew this well. When they were going shore, they probably stoppered the barrel. You can wrap the lock. You can actually wax the touch hole, do a number of other things to try to keep the water out of the barrel. Because even if it's unloaded, you don't, you're gonna have to dry that barrel out before you put the powder in. And in a lot of ways, these guys were very, very professional about this. They knew what they were doing. They didn't want to die. They knew if they happened to run into somebody on the beach, because the typical way Buccaneers attacked Spanish towns, they didn't sail up and assault fortifications with the ships. They would have been shot to pieces. They tended to land usually by night. If it was a long distance, they moved by night and then laid up and hid. They would grab anybody they found along the way so they couldn't give the alarm, and sleep during the day and then march and make their assaults by night. Modern forces, like I said, we do the same thing. You're going to lash weapons, anything critical in the boat so that you don't lose it. You tend to want to attack at night, and there's a lot of reasons for that, even with modern optics, night vision devices. Um, it's still a lot easier to hide in the dark than it is during daylight. It's a good time to attack, right before dawn, because you
yeah,
get that element of surprise. And Buccaneers often did this too. You get that element of surprise in the dark, and you gain a measure of control, and then you're starting to get sunlight come up.
yeah,
So that you can, makes it a lot easier for you to evaluate the situation, gain better control over what's going on. Let's just say they hit, they march to their target, they're going to
hmm,
assault the target. Again, very, very similar. You want to suppress enemy fire. Buccaneers would, if it's a small fortification, they're going to start shooting to suppress the defenders, keep them down so they can't fire cannon or do anything else. Then they're going to close up on the walls. They're going to try to pitch grenades over the walls. They want to clear the defenders and then somehow breach either a gate, a palisade, get a ladder up, get over the walls, and keep going. If they're attacking a barricade or forces in the field, again, they want to use this constant rate of fire, suppress the enemy fire, and then flank them and come around the side. And Buccaneers would even load what they called cartridge shot in their muskets, which was basically a musket ball and 7 or 8 swan shots. Swan shot is about triple-aught buckshot. It's a fairly large shot, and they would use this, but it's a big shotgun pattern at short range.
Yeah.
And they would, at close range, they would come around barricades after they flanked them and, just try to clear the defenders off like that. And this is very similar to modern tactics. If you're doing a target assault, you got a base element that's going to hit the target and try to suppress the fire, and then you got a flanking element and this is conventional throughout, just all modern forces do this.
Yeah.
The maneuvering element's going to go around the flank. You're going to get a crossfire going, and the maneuvering element's going to come into the target, and then you can bring the base element in. Similar if you're hitting a small fortification or something, you want to suppress their fire, and then somebody's going to come around close. Think about World War II pillboxes, things like that. Suppress the fire from the pillbox, get somebody up close, use explosive devices, pitch them in and clear it. So the fundamental tactics in a lot of ways are the same, especially when you get down to small unit tactics.
The use of smoke is also like one
Yes,
of those
I
very
did not
crucial
mention
points.
that. Yeah. I mean, black powder causes a lot of smoke itself, that'll clear, but yeah, modern, you know, they've got smoke, they've got much better communications, they've got a much greater volume of fire,
Yeah.
because of the amount of ammunition that modern forces carry. A Buccaneer might, standard loadout would have been about 30 cartridges,
Yeah.
and we do know that from a Spanish eyewitness at Veracruz in 1683, a lot of Buccaneers, this priest said, had 2 cartridge boxes. And if they were
Yeah.
standard size, they may have had up to 60, but these guys aren't going to get more than 3 or 4 rounds out a minute. After 8 to 10, maybe 12 rounds, they're going to have to swab and clean that barrel because of powder fouling. You will not be able to load another ball into that barrel, so very, very different today in the sense of the volume of fire, the communications. They've got much better, you can communicate with other elements. Buccaneers rarely were bringing artillery ashore. If they did, it
Yeah.
was usually local captured artillery. Yes, they definitely had this very, very good. They're very familiar with land warfare. They also had a lot of people. They could hit cities with up to 1,000 or more men. They could actually gather large numbers and go in and see. I'm trying to think if there's any other major differences. They're mostly technological today and have to do with technology and discipline.
Yeah.
And of course, the purposes as well. Buccaneers wanted to get in there and then sack the city as quick as they can before the riches could be moved out. A modern force wants to get in there and consolidate things for security. They want to suppress and control the territory, and then they're going to be disciplined. Hopefully, they're disciplined. We know historically in 17th, 18th, and 19th century, you saw a lot of plundering.
Right.
That was fairly common in discipline ashore. And I
Yeah.
know English sailors were particularly noted for it once they got ashore. I know we still have examples of poor discipline among militaries,
Yeah.
particularly when their officers aren't doing their job, but that's another subject. But yeah, those are some of the major differences. It's primarily one of technology and discipline.
Since the Buccaneer can only fire 2 shots a minute, it definitely seems like they favor aggression was way more crucial for them
Mhm.
because they have to fire, they have to load, but the enemy also has to fire and load. But if you're out in the terrain, you fire and load, you eventually have to clean and swab the musket.
Mhm.
Doing that without proper cover, or concealment is,
Mhm.
difficult. So it seems way more preferable to me, that you fire and try to get
Mhm.
inside as quickly as
Yes.
possible.
Yes. If they come ashore, keep that constant rate of fire going. Like I said, it's one man loading, one man firing, and even if you have to swab that barrel, they can do it very quickly.
Right.
All you need is a little bit of wet tow and get in there and swab it enough just to clear some of that fouling out. Keep on the move. They don't want to get pinned down. They were fortunate in that Spanish forces were often poorly armed. William
Yeah.
Dampier makes it clear they're poorly armed. They were using matchlocks. And now I did have a modern reenactor who was very familiar with matchlocks, and he proved to me that you can fire, 3 a minute. But my point was
Mm,
that it's also, you're talking about exceptional circumstances, that you're
right.
really trained and highly disciplined and practice all the time. That was not the case with, Spanish soldiers. The flintlock is the ideal weapon for fighting in campaign and unconventionally and in the field. And eventually, it replaced the matchlock. It's not that Spain did not have some victories. They had some significant victories at times. One of the most significant was during what we call King William's War over here. Let's say 1688, 1697.
Yeah.
A Spanish force um, landed on Saint Domingue, and the French, their militia, much of their militia was composed of French filibusters, flibustiers, Buccaneers, with their classic Buccaneer muskets, which
Yeah.
we can get to in a minute if you want. Um, and they were so confident that when Spain, they drew up in their conventional, line of battle and everything, we're going to fire volleys. These French just, firing from cover, we're just going to slaughter them. Well, Spanish had put lanceros, most of whom
Hmm.
were men of color, around the side, armed with these long lances.
Yeah.
And they just, Buccaneer, while they were firing, they just launched an attack from the flank. And at close range, nothing but they slaughtered the French. I mean, they just wiped them out. And French began running for the hills. Their officers, including the governor, tried to command them to stay still, and they were cut down too. I mean, it's gallant French courage.
So you covered a bit some of the weaknesses of the Buccaneers. What would you say are the big weaknesses of the Marines? Like what is a of course we shouldn't give the enemy any ideas, but what do
Oh,
the Marines
that's
have to watch
something.
out for?
Yeah, overconfidence is probably a big one.
Mm,
It's the Marine, Marines around the world, they always tend to consider themselves something of an elite force, special, better than everybody else. And in a
right.
way, if you go back to the origins, at least in the US, let's say World War II, Marines have been around a lot longer than that, but they really
Yeah.
made a name for themselves in the Second World War. Somebody who thinks it's glorious to be in that first wave where they're going to take 90% casualties, and, get up and tell you that's what I want to do. You know,
Mm,
I had an old chief in the Navy and SEAL team. He'd spent a lot of time during Vietnam War in combat, but he used to laugh at that. And he's like, that's the last thing I want to do. He says, I want to sneak up on shore. I want to come in at night. I want to hit them hard and I want to get out of there because I want to go home and I want to stay alive.
yeah.
Um, so sometimes I think overconfidence, it has it serves a good purpose at time. I mean, if you need somebody with that attitude who's going to storm that beach, even if we're probably not storming beaches anymore. But the overconfidence today, that causes a lot of military screw ups right now. That sense that, we know what we're doing. The enemy is weaker than we are. We can do whatever we want. This has always worked. It'll still work. Um, uh, Other weaknesses, like I said, I don't really want to make any criticisms that, well, people probably know them anyway, but
Mm,
they're smaller forces. You don't have, even when you have an amphibious ready group, there's only so many few thousand Marines you can actually put ashore in there. They're vulnerable also because of the sea assets that they're on. If they're actually deployed at sea to come ashore, if you want to stop an amphibious landing, you take out the fleet. And
yeah.
historically, that's what's been done. If you don't let them have any ships, and you sink their ships, and then they're not going to get any people ashore. You've got to get the troops from sea to shore somehow. I don't know if uh, that's not a Marine Corps weakness per se, but it is a weakness of the circumstances in which they're in, is that naval vessels are vulnerable. And in modern, terms, when you can launch missiles and things, it can be very difficult. Even in the 80s, and I had a number of courses in, threats encounters and amphibious warfare and things, it was already becoming a much more dangerous world for amphibious landings.
Right.
It's not that you
Yeah.
can't do the classic World War II anymore where you just run, lines of boats in, send the UDT in to blow the obstacles up and then send the landing craft in. You can mine beaches. They have to send craft in channels. that have been pre-cleared, things like that. And to be honest, nowadays they often use helicopters. They figure, well, we probably don't need to send troops in by sea. If we got enough helicopters, we'll just fly them in and put them ashore. That again remains another vulnerability, aircraft getting shot down. And today, I think a lot of the heavier casualties during amphibious operations are when you
Mm.
lose, like the Falklands. Boats get hit, ships get hit, helicopters get shot down, things like that. Marines, I know Marines, whatever nationality they are, they're usually pretty good once they get on the ground, at doing what they need to do. Their vulnerable moments are the transition moments on boats, ships, helicopters, things like that.
I think the point on confidence there was especially interesting because obviously, as I was in the army myself, for a couple of years, so that confidence is the one of the most important traits you can have. Your trust in your comrades, yourself, to know what you're capable of in your equipment.
Hmm.
But obviously, that can go overboard. Like you can become overconfident and get yourself into think you're
Yeah.
bulletproof and get into dangerous situations.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
think I think it actually sounds like very similar to a lot of the Buccaneers. Like a lot of them became arrogant,
Hmm. Hmm.
and I'm thinking especially like the Battle of Arica in 1681,
Yes.
where Watling of course there were a lot of reasons like he felt like he had to do that attack in order to stay in power and not
Yes.
suffer the same fate as Sharp.
Yeah.
But they went up against. I mean, it's vague, but they were severely outnumbered and they got their asses kicked in the
They
end.
did, and they made tactical errors just because,
Yeah.
like you said, they were just arrogant about it. They split their force. They never should have done that. Yeah, they just did not seem to have good discipline, did not seem to have good leadership. You know, yeah, that guy. If you've ever seen drunk U.S. Marines or drunk Army Rangers, and I don't mean to offend any of you guys out there, but it's like a friend of mine pointed out, it's always the smallest Marine or the smallest Ranger. They get drunk, they're gonna jump on a table and they want to fight everybody. And that is wonderful optimism, that, I'm not gonna get killed on this beach, but it doesn't work out well. Mhm.
Equipment. What are the major differences in equipment?
So
Yeah.
I'm 6'1". This is my height. They tended to have
Yeah.
very thick fish belly like this. Not always fish belly. I've actually identified several different 17th century style stocks. They usually this is a medium-sized lock. They often had a much larger lock than this, typically an octagonal to round barrel. Okay, you can see all this was very, very long weapon, large caliber, originally used for hunting, and they're not being used primarily for volley fire, but for point fire. I suspect a good, well-trained buccaneer could probably hit a target out to about 120 yards, a man-sized target,
Wow.
fairly regularly.
Yeah.
I mean, a well-trained soldier could probably do it out to about 100 yards, and these guys were known for their exceptional shooting. But it's a very sturdy weapon, accurate. That long barrel ensured that the powder burned all the way. These were reputed to have had a longer range too. Okay, so you got a better range on it. They're very smooth handling. The tapered barrel makes it very easy to hold and aim. Okay, it's not, you would think that it would be much more barrel heavy than it is, but it's a
Yeah.
very light, well maneuvered weapon. So this is actually the primary weapon of the Buccaneers. It's a musket of some sort. The French, it's going to be one of these. The English, it could be a variety, including these. But it's the primary weapon. It's not the cutlass like you see in the movies. It's musket. With it, they would have had a musket tool, and in this some 1680s eyewitness illustrations I found in the French National Library of Buccaneers. In a couple, you can actually see them having the musket tool around their neck. What that is it's a small hammer that you could use to chip your flint to sharpen it during action. It usually has a little screwdriver on it for tightening things in the cock, and it usually has a vent pick on it. And they would hang it right around the neck, and you can actually see this. Cartridge box that goes with this, 30 round cartridge boxes would be about this size. We don't know if they had drilled wooden inserts, if Buccaneers did or not, if they lay the cartridges loose. If you lay the cartridges loose, you're going to have to stuff a rag or something in there after you start firing them because loose cartridges are going to break.
Hmm.
Okay. They'll bounce around, they'll break. They would have had one or two large sea pistols. These are large caliber barrels, about 12 to 14 inches. So some would have been larger than this. Um, the caliber, almost as large as a musket. You want a large caliber weapon because it's just got better stopping power. I'm sorry to get so graphic here, but you're more likely to knock your opponent down. These are large, both musket and pistol. You've got fairly low muzzle velocity. What that means is that it's going to hit really, really hard and do a lot of
Yeah.
damage. I had a friend one time who was testing flintlock pistols in modern ballistic gelatin. He said there wasn't a lot of penetration, but he said there was a lot of damage done. And you
Wow.
could probably hit a target with this if you're lucky at 10 yards.
Yeah.
It's just, they're just not that accurate to begin with. I've read a lot of surgeons' accounts of people who were hit with musket and pistol balls and they thought they were dead. The
Oh,
individual thought they were dead.
yeah.
And then all the surgeon found was a big bruise, because
Oh,
these things, the muzzle velocity drops very quickly. So
uh,
it could knock you on the ground, but might not even penetrate. Belt hooks were common on these.
yeah.
If you're marching in the field or something, you're probably going to carry it lock turned in to protect the lock. It is pretty hard to carry all of this stuff. You've got a heavy cartridge box. Some of these people had two of these pistols. You got all this stuff. Then you're going to have a cutlass on your belt also. This is a modern replica of an Excameling type of cutlass. It's a
Oh,
Dutch,
yeah.
cutlass. It's the classic. But anyway, these are your primary weapons. The musket being the number one weapon. The pistol and cutlass are really for close quarters. I did want to point out one more thing. We were talking about firearms earlier or explosives earlier. It's a replica of some fire pots found on La Belle. Often they would put a grenade inside, an iron
Yeah.
grenade inside, and then fill it with powder around it, and you have a fuse coming up from that grenade, or it doesn't have to come up from the grenade. The grenade does have a fuse. You can just have a fuse going into this. And then you would tie a match across it, light it on all of these corners, and then a longer length, and this is for throwing. Okay, you
Yeah.
can grab it. You can see old French army illustrations that show them actually flinging these things over. But the virtue of this is if it breaks the slow match, one of these slow match embers is going to hit the black powder and fire it. If it doesn't break, that fuse is going to fire it anyway.
Hmm.
And so they would have
So
used
the
these.
the grenade on the inside, was it like an additional, not a safety measure, but like an additional trigger essentially, or
Yeah,
additional
we would have
priming?
called
Yeah.
it double priming
Yeah.
basically
Yeah.
with that. Plus, it's going to give you a little bit of extra fragmentation. But those are the primary weapons. The modern comparison is you're
Yeah.
going to have some kind of assault rifle. I'm
Yeah.
not sure what the loadout is for the amount of number of magazines that you're going to be carrying, but it's not a couple hundred rounds at least,
Yeah.
6 or 7 magazines, and you may carry spares too. The Marines probably going to have a couple of canteens of water. Soldiers throughout history have gone out heavily loaded. They'll often have about 40 pounds or more. Even Buccaneers did. It's of what I think in the UK they would call first in line, second line of equipment. Your weapons, today they're using, high-tech vests and things,
Yeah.
as opposed to the old, type of web gear we had back in the 80s. Um, but it's primarily, they're probably gonna have some grenades, some smokes. That's a good point about the smoke. Probably a knife, which is pretty much useless except
Yeah.
as a tool, for,
But a
you
very,
know,
very good tool.
yes, it's a necessary tool, but it's everybody, all Marines and Navy SEALs and everybody want a really killer knife, but
One of the big similarities I see is, of course, in the cartridge box. Like it's very similar
Mhm.
to the just the pouches and bags that you have like on a modern vest where you
Mhm.
put magazines, but also other items. Like of course the Buccaneers, I think they would also put various tools for repair
Yes.
materials and stuff, wadding stuff like that
Yes,
in the
you
boxes.
would need to have all of that in the boxes. You have to have them somewhere. You're going to have a ball extractor somewhere. You're going
Yeah,
to have a worms, a toe worm, a little screw
yeah,
that it can screw on. It can be metal to screw on. Some of them are just kind of friction related. You put it on the end of the ramrod, but you've got to have all those things too. You've got to be able to repair and maintain the weapons, or they simply won't work. And Buccaneers were very good at that too, keeping their weapons in good repair because their lives depended on them. We do know, and this was fascinating when I found the illustration. There is a very good illustration from the 1680s of a French buccaneer who's clearly going on campaign. So he's got like a little backpack on him. He's also got a length of fabric wrapped around his waist, and that is, from written descriptions we know, is mosquito netting. It's a very, very, very thin, light cloth. These guys would basically put two sticks in the ground, throw the netting over it, wrap it around. It's kind of like a little pup tent we used to call in the
Yeah.
US, and would sleep under that. And he's got one pistol locked turned in. He's holding his cartridge up. He's got a large cartridge box, and they wore them on the left front, unlike a lot of conventional forces in the 17th and 18th centuries kept them on the right side because they would draw it with their right hand.
Yeah.
These guys kept it on the left side, one or two pistols on the right side, and then a cutlass on the left side too, and it balances out pretty well.
Yeah.
Look at that. And what things they might have in their pockets. Their footwear, a lot of Buccaneers were poor and barefoot, which is, that's another point we can make. Modern uniforms and things are designed to, help protect. Body armor is something else I didn't cover, but a lot of, not all, but commandos especially will have body armor. A lot of even conventional troops, including Marines, will often wear body armor of some sort. They did have some, musket and pistol proof, breast and back then. But if anybody wore it, we don't know if any Buccaneers ever wore it.
Of course, it's very heavy, and usually like the ones who wore the musket and pistol proof. Usually it was cavalrymen because they're sitting on a horse, and the
Yes.
horse can carry it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're marching through the jungle like a Buccaneer, it's gonna
Yeah.
weigh you down.
These guys look dashing, by the way, too. It's another difference, today you're
Yeah.
not, Marines aren't running shore wearing scarves around their neck and, they're trying to keep the profile low and fire from
Yeah.
cover and, blend in with camouflage. Not, I mean, these Buccaneers, and they had plumes in their hats and,
The modern armed forces, you associate them so heavily with a good backpack where it's I mean it's heavy, but it's gonna be still comfortable to wear. You have a
yeah,
lot of stuff in it. You mentioned the knapsack, the backpack that the Buccaneer had.
yeah.
What is the big difference of the backpack that a Buccaneer has?
Well, it's not going to have a frame of any sort. It's just going to be loose, hanging right down there. It's smaller than some of these huge backpacks they'll put on troops today, which troops, by the way, have to drop those things before they fight in most cases. You know, um, so it's smaller, it's lighter. We can try to guess what might be in there. For provisions, it's going to be cornmeal, probably. Boucan, which is basically just slowly dried smoked pork, which you can't really eat until you soak it in water. Maybe they had a canteen in there made from a calabash or something. Maybe a spare shirt. Um, but it would not have held a whole lot of things. I could easily see them having a sewing kit, some dice,
Mm,
maybe a few personal items like that. We don't know because we haven't, archaeologically haven't found one, but the fact that they're wearing one, indicates that they're carrying more things than that.
of
Yeah.
course, one of the big advantages that Buccaneers had, which of course they didn't carry as much as a modern Marine or soldier does. But when they did carry a lot of stuff, they had slaves to go on campaign with
Hmm.
them to carry a lot of stuff for them. But of course, that can also be a bit of a disadvantage because in the Pacific campaign, I think it is Lionel Wafer who writes about it, or one of them. He says, sometimes the slaves would run away. They take the
Yeah,
stuff and they just leg it.
yeah, and it's exactly what they should have been doing.
To sort of wrap up this thing on the carry weight, do you think of course, Marines wouldn't have, hopefully, they wouldn't have slaves, but do you think they could benefit in some regard from having just people that are there just to carry stuff, or would this slow down expeditions unnecessarily?
It really depends on the kind of expedition. I know some of the Pacific Islands, and I'm pretty sure it's U.S. Marines have had donkeys or mules. I know in World War
Mm,
One they'd carry, pack animals in even on amphibious landings to carry some of these things up to spare the troops from carrying
wow.
these things in.
Okay.
Ammunition, heavier machine guns, things like that. It really depends on if they're having to move inland very quickly or if they're going to just have to clear a local area. And the Pacific Islands were, they're very difficult to clear. I mean,
Yeah.
it was so bad that I've talked to some veterans from those campaigns, and
Oh, wow. Yeah.
they're still bitter about it. It's just, I mean, they said they just wouldn't surrender, and
Yeah.
we just had to fight for every inch.
Wow.
And in that case, but yeah, you bring up a good point about 17th, 18th century armies that had the huge baggage trains
Yeah.
and camp followers and everything else, and officers. I'm reading that James II's his account of his service with the French in the Spanish in the mid-17th century. He had multiple horses,
Mm,
just him
yeah,
alone, he had a couple of war horses, if I recall correctly. Plus, he had a couple of just, nags for riding during the day. He had
yeah.
all kinds of staff and servants, and, you know, just one noble officer in there has got a huge baggage train himself just for that one individual to go fight.
Buccaneers, they would often have a servant with them, a personal slave, some
Mhm.
sort of cabin boy with them. Even regular crewmen
Yeah.
could, have like a boy servant with him or
Yep.
something like that.
And that would have, carrying any extra baggage. But I mean, that you could, if you trusted them and they were loyal, it'd be quite useful. And I
Yeah.
suspect a lot of them were also there to fight as well.
This wasn't actually a point I had originally, but I think it's very interesting that you got into it and mentioned it. And that is, regarding like uniforms and like clothing and equipment. So of course,
Hmm.
like a modern marine, and like I can say this, from my own experiences as well. Like a modern uniform, it fulfills so many purposes. For
Hmm.
as a basic, it provides the camouflage. It protects you against cuts from vegetation. It's fireproof. It has like a bunch of pockets where you can store little snacks or ammunition and
Hmm.
bullets and stuff. And of course, you have really good boots. Of course, some people are gonna complain about the boots and
Hmm.
are, it depends on everyone's feet and genetics and stuff. I never
Yeah.
had any problems with mine.
Hmm.
Um, but obviously, like equipment that has over the centuries, just been tailored for like this campaigning purpose. How does that compare to what the Buccaneers got?
They appear to have had fairly durable clothing. Camouflage was not an issue. We have a Spanish eyewitness, like at Veracruz, 1683. He wasn't a military man, so you have to sometimes translate his language very carefully. He called things by the incorrect names, but it's pretty obvious what they are. But you notice that a lot of them were wearing blue, their coats,
Yeah,
probably indigo dyed. But you also notice that they were made of sackcloth or sailcloth. These are very durable coats. And again, these guys probably didn't have a lot of money, but most of them were waist length or mid-thigh length, not the super long, coats that we're accustomed to seeing pirates in.
so more like a jacket.
They had the hats, which they really need for sun protection,
Mm,
but they were often plumed. You see some of these guys, they have lace cravats, they're
yeah,
going to battle with it. They're very, and at the same time, not all, and some of them have kind of conventional breeches, but many of them have the broad petticoat type sailor breeches, which
yeah,
are heavy canvas. So this is pretty durable clothing. For footwear, some had conventional shoes of leather. Some of them clearly had the classic shoes that XMLA measures, from cow hocks or beef or bull hawk, cow hocks or pig hocks. They basically just cut a strip off the legs at the hock, which is your heel would fit, turn it inside out real quick, scrape all the flesh off the inside, turn it back outside, raw, pull it on, cut it off at the ankle, tie the toes. They look almost like these long pointed medieval shoes. And a
yeah,
lot of these, and the Spanish eyewitness mentions it, that a lot of them are wearing these. They're cheap. They would not take them off till they wore out. I had
yeah,
somebody ask me, isn't that kind of gross? And I'm like, well, it's a lot of things gross. It's some grosser things. But they must have had pretty tough feet, a lot of them, to
yeah.
come in but there are also accounts of barefoot buccaneers being their feet getting all torn up on the rocks and um, which is a hindrance. Armies run on their stomachs and on their feet, and if you can't, if you take away to one of those things, you've got a problem.
Speaking about the stomachs, one of the sort of when you look at Buccaneers when they go on campaigns, they deliberately choose not like you talked about canteens before. They might have water with them, but oftentimes
Hmm.
they didn't because they said like, "Oh, we're gonna go past the lake or we're gonna go by a river."
Yeah.
And oftentimes they would say, "We're not gonna bring any food." Henry Morgan did it at Panama.
Hmm.
He didn't bring any food, which perhaps not the best idea because they
Yeah.
expected like, "Yeah, we can live off the land."
Hmm.
And this was, of course, something which armies did a lot, like the Western design. They also said, oh, we'll just live off the land. Of course, this resulted in a lot of plundering, like you said, which
Yeah.
leads to a breakdown of discipline and
Hmm.
drunkenness and stuff. How do Marines get their provisions? And is the way Marines do it a superior system to living off the land and foraging and stuff?
Any if they're doing an amphibious landing, they're going to have follow-on forces that are going to bring in logistics, who are going to bring in all of this stuff. Some of the practice amphibious landings, we would support amphibious landings by having to do reconnaissance or raids inland or something. So I've done a few of those back when I was in the Navy. And normally, once they've secured the beachhead, they're going to bring in pallets of, I don't know if they're still using MREs, they're just the packaged meals. You rip it
Yeah.
open, everything's in a olive drab foil package. And they just got pallets of those things stacked up on the beach. For us, if we were just doing something overnight, we might take one or two meals, strip them down, stick them in a butt pack or a backpack if we had one.
With this one, this is supposed to be, I mean, it's half open. This is supposed to be like
Mhm.
a 24-hour meal. So it's
Uh-huh.
got it's got breakfast, lunch, dinner. It's got some
Yeah.
snacks in it, some coffee and
Mhm.
stuff. Says it's 3,600 calories. I got a meal
What you
package. This
need.
is supposed to be a dinner or lunch. This is
Mhm.
Thai chicken taste coconut. If that sounds, I don't know, someone's probably gonna enjoy it.
But
Yes.
Buccaneers, I'm pretty sure they would have had boucan and some cornmeal, and probably wouldn't last long. Like you said, probably hope that they could plunder everything off provisions locally. But the downside of that is if people know you're coming, they just drive the cattle away and don't leave anything there for you. But there's plenty of accounts of Buccaneers just ravenously finding orchards and fruit, and just you can tell how bad their diet at sea was because they're ecstatic that they've got fresh fruit and
Oh yeah.
fresh vegetables, and that's like paradise for them.
Would you say that this is like a big difference overall between Buccaneers and like modern forces and Marines, the whole logistic system?
I think that's probably a very, very good point. Because, like I said, Buccaneers were their logistics was we're going to go ashore, we're going to raid the Spanish town, and we're going to plunder it, and we'll have everything we need right there.
No, so having talked about the sort of equipment and provisions and stuff, where I think we can delve a bit more into sort of like the unit structure and things like that.
Mhm.
So what is and you talked a bit about it before, like Buccaneers and also Marines, they operate in like pairs, but what does
Mhm.
like a bigger unit look like? Uh, because I know that, like, of course, modern military forces, you have like a group which is usually like
Yes.
10 people, led by
Mhm.
like a corporal, sometimes a sergeant, and then you
Yeah.
have then you have like a company which is like 50 persons or whatever,
Yeah.
or a platoon, it might be called.
Mhm.
Did the Buccaneers have anything similar above the two-man pair?
Well, we know they had companies,
Yeah.
and I know from accounts of the French at Veracruz in 1683, they not only had companies, but each company had its own flag, just like conventional forces. And they did have companies. Now, what the breakdown of that below that was, we don't really know. We do know
Mm,
that they led by example,
right.
with their leaders in the front. It's something you really don't see today. Officers tend to be more toward the rear, with the exception of special operations forces, for example. I know that in SEAL team, and you're patrolling, it's point man, officer, radium, and on back, and you're I had an old master chief that had, God, I think he had 7 tours in Vietnam, pulled me as a very young officer aside one day, and he's like, Mr. Little, I want you to understand that when you're in the field, he says, you're at the front. And he said, so when you screw up, just remember, he said, I was caught in ambushes 3 or 4 times, and every time the first 2 or 3 guys got killed. And he said, remember, you're the number 2 guy up there and you're leading it. So if you screw up, you're not just going to get your own people killed, you're going to get killed. But there's a virtue, I think, from leading from the front too. It gives you a certain amount of control. And we know that Buccaneers did this because there's numerous examples of their captains getting killed. We don't know if they broke down into smaller units than the company size units, or how they really functioned and how they kept command and control, because there's just not a lot of information on it. Modern forces, even if you've got like a Marine platoon, and I apologize to any U.S. Marines out there if I get this wrong. It's, last time I worked Marines was in the 80s,
Yeah.
but they'll break it down even down to small fire teams.
Yeah.
And a fire team is usually going to be at least 4 men, where you can have two that would set up a base element to try to
Hmm.
suppress enemy fire, and two that could flank. So I wouldn't be surprised if Buccaneers had something like that. I mean, if you're a small company of Buccaneers and you're going to assault a barricade, you're probably going to want part of that force to lay down that suppressing fire on the barricade, and the other part's going to want to flank. So I'm sure they broke themselves down into what we might call platoons.
I think actually one piece of evidence pointing to them having these smaller divisions, if you look at quarter bills aboard
Hmm.
ships. So the for those who don't know, quarter bills are the essentially the orders you have for an engagement at sea. And if
Hmm.
you look at the quarter bills from the late 18th century, which are probably similar to the ones from previous century and from the earlier decades, they say that like even just positions like the tops, which are platforms up in the masts where you have a couple of
Hmm.
guys with muskets and grenades and stuff. There is always like an officer delegated to these
Yes.
positions or quarters. So you have like one officer for the main deck, one for the bow, and then the even the broadside is divided between two officers, and then
Yeah.
the master gunner who's overseeing everything. And I think like this could be evidence pointing to, and also like if you have a boat, like a small boat, that boat is going to be led by a coxswain, who's the officer of the boat. So I think
Mhm.
this could be evidence of them deploying, like having a similar system at sea, having these officers who are
Yeah.
used to leading the tops, leading the boats, also leading smaller units to do like what you say,
Yeah.
like laying down fire on a area and
You
stuff.
absolutely have to. You have to have gun captains. You've got to have people assigned to the gun crews. There's going to be one man on that gun crew who's the gun captain. You're going to have some formal officer on that deck too, who's going to be ensuring that the guns are managed properly.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's no way about it. I just wish we had, these are little details you have to cull from reading
yeah.
journals. And since journals are usually describing events, it's incidentally that you get the small details of how they actually did things.
Could officers of these smaller teams, and now I'm talking about both Buccaneers and in the Marines, is initiative in these smaller units something which is rewarded and promoted?
It's supposed to be, but in here, I don't want to get too much into inter-service rivalries and discipline, and I can only speak for the United States Armed Forces. But you still see this distinction today between, let's say, the U.S. Army and the Air Force, which grew out of the U.S. Army, and the Navy and the Marine Corps. U.S. Navy and Marine Corps officers still have a lot more independence than their counterparts in the Army and the Air Force do. Our regulations were written to a sense that if it wasn't prohibited, you could do it. And I know probably some of my uh, fellow Army and Air Force former personnel may disagree with this, but it's often quite frustrating when you try to get them to do something. They say, "Can you show me where it says we can do that?" And I'm like, "Show me where it says you can't." And if and there's this very distinct difference because armies have to, they're part of a very cohesive, large scale unit. They have to be. They have to follow orders and do everything. Navy historically, you had ships sent off, and captains had a lot more latitude because of lack of communication and things like that. They had a lot more independence. And I did know that even in Navy as a naval officer and as a Navy SEAL, we had back then, I don't know that it's the same today, but back then, the platoon commander, who was a very young officer, like I was an '03 in a Navy lieutenant, had a lot of authority and a lot of independence. Um, like I said, if it wasn't prohibited, whether it was tactics or whatever, I could probably try it. You're talking about Marines and things. Yes, it should be rewarded. Ideally it should be rewarded. It probably, I don't know, I hope it still is rewarded, that kind of independence. And I'm not picking too much of the U.S. Army either because I know they had a lot of officers who were also rewarded for, sharp thinking, especially, tactical thinking.
Right.
Tactics is the big thing for, in the military. And if you're a U.S. military officer in the Navy, if you're a line officer in the Army, if you're a field officer, basically your frontline type officers, tactics is the old fitness reports, you wanted an A in tactics because anything else is the end of your career. You really, like you could suffer some other, lower marks possibly, but not in tactics. So yeah, I'm assuming that they're still rewarding that kind of independence,
Right.
and that tactical thinking. I mean, they don't want you running around doing something stupid, and that's why young officers like me had a veteran platoon chief behind me to say, "Sir, that's a really stupid idea." And I'm thinking, well, Chief, I'm going to rely on your experience, and so maybe we'll rethink this because,
And I mean, you talked early on about one of the big differences being that uh, the Buccaneers were very democratic. And looking back at my own experiences in the army, the Swedish armed forces, I'm from Sweden for those who don't know. There's actually a lot of democracy internally in the Swedish army.
Mhm.
So, for example, when I was doing basic training, and then when I was in the army itself for a while, usually in like the groups, in like the smaller units, you would have the officers and the higher ups. They would promote you to do essentially like surveys, and they would promote you to have these. You would actually have formal set dates where you would have discussions, and you would
Mhm.
sort of talk about how you felt about the exercise, for example, and how you felt about the plans, and how you felt about the leadership,
Mhm.
and then present these opinions to the leadership to see improvements. And even just like when we would draw up plans of attack and stuff like that and operations, there would always be like a communication, at least on a unit level, between just the regular privates and the corporal or sergeant in charge. And I'm thinking, I looking historically, of course, there's we're gonna go into the Buccaneers in a bit, but of course, in the regular armed forces of this period, it's unheard of. But looking at, for example, the new model army, which of course many Buccaneers would have their origins in, they had a lot of this democracy on like a small and even a large level too. And of course, they were very politically involved. So they would have a lot of political radicals that would get have a lot of influence in the on a state level and such like that. Um, but just starting out with the Marines, is there any sort of democratic element to the Marines?
I would probably say no, but I don't know what's going on it today. Now, I will say I wouldn't call it democracy, but I, as a as a platoon commander in SEAL team, and assistant platoon commander, a couple times I got injured on a first deployment
Mm.
and came back pick up another platoon. But I wouldn't call it democracy because that officer's in charge and he's got his chief who he can overrule, but it's basically the officer, he is in charge, and that's the same thing in the Marine Corps. Although you rely heavily on the experience of some of your senior enlisted. Ideally, your senior enlisted are not should not be calling all the shots. Now, I'm not going to go into some details about some military organizations where that's gotten out of hand. You can look around news reports, and there are plenty where special operations forces, the officers have basically abandoned their responsibilities, turned it over
Wow.
to senior enlisted, and you've seen some war crimes and other things
Oh,
happen because basically that's why I said earlier, officers not doing their jobs. But I wouldn't call it democratic, but we develop these things as a team. SEAL team is called team for a reason, and we develop
yeah.
these things as a team. You needed your people on board with it. We don't want to do anything stupid. And so while technically as an officer, I could say this is how it's going to do, and we're going to do it, I'm going to sit down there and take the counsel of my platoon chief and also some of the other experts that I have within my platoon. Even though we're all trained in the same things, I've got an ordnance expert, I've got other experts too, and we're going to work on those things because, you know, so in some ways, I guess it's probably similar. I do know that during World War II, there were even some U.S. Army officers, one in particular, and I can't think of his name, who had worked with some of the communist partisans,
Mm.
and they actually incorporated some of those same practices. Sit down with everybody, like you were just saying. Let's talk about this. What do you think? Is this a good idea? Is a bad idea? And even in SEAL team, we did that to some degree. But
Yeah.
the officer was in charge. The officer was responsible. He got to make the final call on this. Whether his platoon is like. Now, I will tell you, in the Marines, they're going to follow orders and they're going to do what they want. And to a large degree, their officers and senior enlisted probably might not want the opinion of the average Marine. Now, I might be wrong on this. Again, like I said, I did not serve in the Marines. I did go through an officer candidate program where we had Marine Corps drill instructors. They had all served at, the classic U.S. Marine drill instructor. They'd all done tours at Marine Corps recruiting depot at Paris Island or San Diego, and you didn't argue with these guys. They were training young officers and you didn't argue with them at all. It was straight out of, like Hollywood films where they've hired former Marine drill instructors. This is exactly what it was like.
Wow. Yeah.
It was very strict discipline and, you didn't mess with them. You didn't even look them in the eye for the first 3 weeks or they'd be all on you. You just looked straight ahead and hope that they walked past you without giving you too much grief. So yeah, Marines are highly disciplined and they need that. You don't need to start arguments with your troops or everybody. And there's always some idiot with a completely stupid opinion too. That's a balance.
And how does this compare to the democratic elements of the Buccaneers and the leadership among them?
I know they kept a lot of councils. I really wish we had a recording of some of those councils to see how much participation there actually was. Um, they would take votes. We know that before any major action. The captain may be in charge, but he could not just say, "We're going to attack Arica tomorrow, so get ready." They would have immediately said, "No, let's take a vote on this." So they were voting on major actions. To some degree, that might be wise because they had a lot of experience in there. But like it said, we both know we've read plenty of accounts of that attack on Arica. It was a disaster, and it was a disaster from the beginning. And you could look at it. You don't need hindsight to see it's a
Yeah,
disaster. You just look at the evidence and realize that this guy is doing it because he wants to keep, his position. He's trying to consolidate his
yeah,
position as captain. So democracy might not always be the best way, but the big difference is these guys want to profit. They're plundering towns. If everybody disagreed it's a bad idea, then that's fine because it's not going to change the fate of nations, probably. Whereas with the military force, you need that strict discipline. You don't need people arguing about orders. You don't need people
right.
saying, "Well, he didn't take my opinion. I disagree. I'm just not going to participate." You can't have that kind of. I'm sure that officers, and I hope they do, talk to their senior enlisted and they work these things out, but they're probably not going to spend much time. They're not going to take a Marine company commander is not going to let his Marines vote on,
Yeah.
he might vote on, "Hey, what do you guys want to do for liberty?" But he's not going to vote on, "Hey, do you think we should attack it this way or this way?" It's
Yeah.
not going to happen. It's going to come up with a plan, and the senior enlisted are going to say, "Here's what we're doing." And they're going to say, "Aye, aye, sir."
Yeah, no, and of course, like in my experiences when I was in the army, it was never like, we voted on whether we would get an order and we would do the
Yeah.
order. It was more so like might discuss how would we complete the mission. Like someone
Hmm.
might say, oh, we should use this vehicle or we should go in this
Yeah.
way, or
Hmm.
maybe we can, and often, we would come up with very creative and weird solutions to very specific tasks and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, I think
Uh,
that's a good idea too. And that's very
yeah,
similar to what we would do. The same way you get everybody down with this is our mission. This is the usual way we approach it, but let's talk about this. And because we had a lot of smart people in there and
yeah,
they really did what they wanted. And we all wanted the mission to succeed. So, and I don't think it was a sense of we get a vote in this. It was more of a let's work on this and let's figure out the best way to make this work.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that can be a very good thing because, like I said, if you've got an ignorant officer or an arrogant officer or somebody trying to prove something, you know, it's, you've been there, and there's
yeah.
good officers, and then there's mediocre officers, and then there's bad officers, and it's like anywhere else.
Definitely. And I think like even people who haven't been in any sort of
Mhm.
armed forces or anything, they're going to be able to relate because everyone has had a bad boss or something like that.
Yeah, it's.
So one of the things that I was curious to get into as well, like, and this is a bit of a battlefield specific. Modern armed forces, and I reckon the Marines as well, make heavy use of formations. So not a formation in the term of the 17th century, where a regular
Yeah.
army is gonna stand in a
Hmm.
tercio or like a line of battle or anything like that. But you might have guys standing in a line where it's like 2 meters distance. You might have like a ziplock formation where it's like one guy at the end. He runs past the entire line, and then you swing as a
Hmm.
maneuver, sort of stuff like that.
Hmm.
And a lot of these formations, there's marching formations, you have formations for
Hmm.
battle and moving in terrain, and also formations for if someone is wounded, for retrieving the wounded.
Yeah, Marines will be doing that. You have to do the same things. You've got to have your contact drills. You've got to have a particular way to assault a target. You've got to have, your wounded man drills, how to, pull them out. The exceptions to that, of course, being you're not going to do that during an actual assault. You're going to secure the target before you do that. But yeah, they absolutely have to. You can't be a modern military force and not do it. You can't just go out pell-mell like Hollywood style. Let's just charge the beach and keep shooting. That's what you
Yeah.
train and train and train for these basic types of assaults. I suspect Buccaneers could do a lot of these, the 17th century terms of it. We do know that they were capable of, there was a mutiny um, during the 1697, I think before they departed Saint-Domingue, the Buccaneers under the Pontiff,
Mm.
the arrogant French commander, they marched down. Some of their officers, some of their men were arrested, or one of them was. They marched, and the eyewitness says, four by four in good order. good military order down to demand the release of this. So, that's impressive. These are, you know, somebody has to practice that. You can't just
Yeah.
put it together in one day and it work because we've all done, military drill and nobody learns that in 10 minutes, even simple marching.
Yeah.
They had to have practiced these things at some point. Anyway, they had to have practiced. There's no way that
Yeah.
they did not practice this. And we do have accounts of them lining up and firing conventional volleys. We
Yeah.
have, again, I wish we had a manual or somebody wrote that we trained all day on marching
Yeah.
or whatever. But the fact that they were doing these things shows that they had to have practiced it.
Right.
You had some kind of drills, which means you had somebody acting as some kind of a sergeant or senior petty officer, keeping them in line. And, I don't know how well they would have taken that. And I could imagine the jokes running through the ranks as they're doing this. Because you've been in the military, you know the jokes that are already running through the ranks. And if you've
Yeah.
got a less disciplined force, it probably would have been funny to hear.
Would any of these formations that the Buccaneers used, especially when they operated in the more loose manner of like two, like a fire team, two guys, a pair, would they ever have used any formations that would have been similar to what armed forces do today, do you think?
I doubt it. We do know that when they were working right through jungles, they tended to do what was common back then, and some forces may do today. They're probably marching about four abreast. They're going to have some flankers on either side who are basically scouts. Um, we didn't really do that from my perspective when I was, in the teams, primarily because if they get out of sight, you hear something, you don't want to shoot your own people. That's in some ways less of a problem with flintlock muskets in larger ranges. There's if somebody even accidentally fires it takes a moment and there's a little bit of a lag and you might very well miss because of the accuracy of the weapon and everything. But probably some formations are similar. But again, I'm not fully up to date with what modern Marines as far as their, moving internally. And again, I don't want to get into too much detail, even if I knew. I don't want to say, here's how the Marines are going to march in and attack
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
your fortification.
Yeah.
Um, but movement toward target, probably moved online, which is a common thing to do today when attacking a target.
Yeah.
Everybody's online, everybody's firing. You're going to get your flanking force around the same way. That's the same way the patrol order. I wouldn't be surprised if they're forlorn.
Hmm.
They would always have an advance force, very conventional, 17th, 18th century.
Yeah. Vanguard.
Of course, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't move in a much narrower file,
Hmm.
with a fair amount of distance in between them. Just simply to avoid ambushes or running up onto barricades with cannon and things like that. If you spread out, you're less likely to be taken out by small shot from a cannon, ranged out of that's the problem with running in narrow files. If you run into a target right in front of you, it can take out the whole line of people.
Yeah.
Um, but again, if moving on roads and things like that, going the opposite way can make it just as difficult, to move through the terrain and keep control. We know they lost people, that people were laggard. That's always a problem in military operations in any formation, move a tactical
Hmm.
formation, keeping your people up, keeping them where they need to go, not losing stragglers.
Yeah.
Somebody stops that, tie his shoelace, and the next thing you know, the guy in front of him has disappeared and then he's lost and wandering off somewhere. And, you know,
And that's also a reason why you operate in pairs, right? Because in a pair,
mhm.
you have a guy watching your back, and you need to communicate
Yeah.
between the lines,
Yeah. And
always.
that's two's always better than one. Hollywood always has that one, that single commando who can do everything. But,
And we talked about, and you said one of the big strengths of the Marines and modern forces today is the logistics. And bringing that into formations and sort of battlefield tactics, how would Buccaneers go about retrieving the wounded and treating the wounded in an engagement?
all we know is that after they would assault a target, they would generally pick a church as a central location, send their surgeons in there. Um, and then start moving the wounded in there, at least people that weren't off getting drunk and plundering. I don't know if during action Buccaneers were running around and grabbing their wounded and dragging
Mm,
them back out, or if they were doing more of what we would have done, and that's you just keep moving, you secure the target, then you tend to your wounded.
right.
And a lot of that depends on force size too. If you've got a large force moving through and you've got men down, you can probably spare a couple of people or even have slaves or somebody designated to come up and pull
Mm,
the wounded out and get them to the hospital. The smaller unit where you've got everybody's got to be shooting, you can't afford to lose a weapon. You're probably going to move through the target and return to your wounded, as soon
right.
as you secure them safe, when you can spare the people to do it.
You talked about marching order and the vanguard and the people sort of scouting ahead. And
Mhm.
I'm going to ask about both Marines and the Buccaneers, but in the Swedish armed forces, we actually make a lot of use of dogs, so military trained
Mhm.
dogs. And these dogs are used for tracking. They're used in camps as a sort of alarm system. And of
Mhm.
course, they can also, check people for drugs, if you need the military
Yeah.
as like a police force and stuff. It's a great
Mhm.
utility tool. And reading about well, firstly, I'm gonna ask that: do the Marines make any use of dogs in such a similar
I'm
fashion?
sure they do. I know they used them during World War II in Vietnam, and I'm certain they're using them today too. We
Yeah,
didn't make too much use, and I didn't see them too much back in the 80s, but they were there. They were
yeah.
canine handlers. They're very useful.
Because I know there is from King Philip's War, which of course was this conflict in
Yes.
New England, where the
Hmm.
King Philip, a Native American, I don't remember his real name, sadly, he led a war against the English. And there was this group of former Buccaneers. They called themselves, I think, Bradley's Privateers or something like that.
Yeah.
They were
Hmm.
employed as mercenaries against the Native
Hmm.
Americans, and
Yeah.
they made heavy use of dogs.
Hmm.
They use dogs for tracking,
Yeah.
and they use dogs also in interrogation and
Hmm.
specifically
Yeah.
torture as a terror tactic.
Hmm.
And I've seen like in some of the accounts of this group and also historians talking about it, drawing the connection to the Buccaneers, like you say, the hunters, like they
Hmm.
had dogs. And so what we're essentially seeing is a sort of we're seeing the beginning, the Buccaneers, they have the dogs, and we're seeing the end
Hmm.
here, King Philip's
Yeah.
War and these privateer mercenaries using dogs.
Hmm.
And it's just this like middle, like did they bring
Yeah.
these dogs to the Caribbean? Yeah,
Yeah,
go
I
on.
haven't seen a single account that I can recall that mentions the use of dogs, unfortunately. I mean, even Sharp, they had one dog on the ship. It was a pet, and
Yeah.
they were talking about eating it for
Yeah.
Christmas,
Yeah, and it was a tiny one as well, like a cocker spaniel or something, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But that's another really good question, but I can't recall seeing anything right now on any of these where the dogs were brought out
Yeah.
um, to use in the Vanguard to try to, I mean, they're good for signaling danger. And it would be,
Yeah.
honestly, if you had the dogs, it'd be foolish not to have them. But I can't think of a single account where I read that, where they actually brought the dogs up. Um, what they did often have is had local guides if they could,
Yeah.
usually forced guides. You get the guides up there and you put them in the front also, or if there were any member of their own crew who had been there before or had lived there before. There were a number of when the French Buccaneers in 1683 sacked Veracruz, there were a number of them aboard who had lived there.
And one of the things they did during the Veracruz attack is they did like a stealth attack where they had a vanguard sneak inside. And some of the
Hmm.
members, those who were Spanish or who looked Spanish, another thing they did or
Hmm.
spoke Spanish, they would dress up in Spanish clothes and like
Yep.
disguise themselves. And
Hmm.
disguising and stuff like that is, of course, a very common tactic as well. And on ships, when attacking a target, you could lie down or you could wear certain hats or something like that.
Yep.
Um, and you can sort of see like a pair. Of course, a Marine can't do that. A Marine can't just like
Hmm.
dress up or something like that.
Yeah.
It's. Would you say like this is sort of like equivalent of the camouflage used today by Marines?
That's about as probably about as close as you're going to get.
Yeah.
That putting the Spanish clothing on, or even getting a Spanish crew member to go up there so he would be misidentified. Um, I know during Vietnam, some of the old SEALs I talked to in Vietnam, occasionally they'd have their point man dressed like Viet Cong. They'd have a straw hat on and wear black pajamas. And they said
Okay. Yeah.
the good point of that is that if you ran into the enemy for a split second, they might not be sure who you are, so you have a tactical advantage over them. They said the downside is if you ran into another one of your own forces by accident, you're probably going to get shot. So,
Yeah. Can you describe a bit how the Marines use camouflage for those who don't know?
at its most basic level is the camouflage uniform. Those were I guess they started getting U.S. Marines started getting some of those. I think in World War II, they were probably the first units to get them. Um, and they're used worldwide nowadays. There's a variety of camouflage units, but they're essentially designed to help break up your profile, so that you can blend in. Well, and I think they do a fairly good job. You can always augment it with all kinds of plant fiber and things on your helmets, and which has been done even historically. I haven't found accounts of Buccaneers doing that. We do know they use cover and concealment regularly, but camouflage needs to be applied with, cover and concealment as well. And
Yeah.
darkness also helps as
Yeah.
well a lot too. We were fanatics about, we work at night a lot. We were also fanatics about camouflaging our faces as
Yeah.
well, and patterns to break it up so that basically your the human faces are very recognizable even in dark. There's two eyes, a nose, and the mouth, the shape. So you want camouflage patterns that kind of break that up, like the old ship camouflage patterns in World War II that kind of break it up so that your mind does not immediately recognize it as what it is.
Right.
Um, but again, and those are the basics of camouflage used by all forces, and you'll get camouflage uniforms if you can get them based on the region you're going to. Desert camouflage might be a little bit different. There's even some night camouflage that works pretty well um, for nighttime. And I know this stuff works pretty well. I've been laying up under concealment, had people 3, 4 feet away. If you combine it again with good vegetation concealment and people don't expect you there, they literally will stand down there, talk, take a leak, have a conversation, not realize that somebody is 3 or 4 feet away.
So how do the Marines cooperate and work with other branches of the U.S. military and Navy?
It really depends on the scale of the type of operation that you're looking for. Marines won't admit it. They're technically part of the Navy. They're an independent service. The Navy will say, "Well, you're part of the Navy. You're Marines." Marines like, "No, we're an independent." But they're
Yeah.
on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but they don't have a vote.
Yeah.
For example. So they are integrated with the U.S. Navy well. They understand the Navy well. They use the same language. They're deployed aboard, U.S. Navy warships, especially amphibious warships, but they're also often deployed on some other ships as security forces.
Hmm.
They have a lot of other jobs as well. I think U.S. forces, this was starting in the 80s after some issues during the invasion of Grenada, or the invasion of a golf course, as a friend of mine called it. They started U.S. military in general started trying to get the forces working better together. I don't know how well they're working, today. Um, but you have to have that integration or your mission is simply going to fail. And it's, as you know, it's a complex thing. Um, you've got ground forces, they're integrating the Marines is going ashore. They have to be integrated with the Navy to get them ashore and for a lot of the logistics needs. Air cover might be provided by the Navy, but it could also be provided by the Army or the Air Force. So you've got to be
Right.
able to talk to each other, and you've got to be able to speak the same language. And services don't always speak the same languages. Like I said, we just already talked about the attitudes toward, certain things, what you can do
Yeah.
and what you can't do. And, it's um, basically what it comes down to is the more you train together with other service components, the better you're going to be able to work with them. You start to understand what they need, how they work together. They start to understand your needs, and it works pretty well together. As far as Buccaneers and other components, there's a number of times that they have been used to augment conventional forces in the late 17th century. It often didn't
Hmm.
go well. At Cartagena, I'm not sure how well that had to do with just the commander's arrogance, but they had very, very distinct ways of doing things, very distinct. The big thing came down to prize money, and the Buccaneers wanted it avoided, shares per man based on this. While the military form was more the officers get most everything, and then it kind of trickles down, to the grunts in the field.
Yeah.
And DuPont basically cheated the Buccaneers, and they actually sued in France later, and they got
Oh,
some of their money back. They won,
wow.
surprisingly.
Wow.
But yeah, that was kind of amazing too that they actually sued and won.
I think the integration between regular forces and Buccaneers seems to have worked really well on Jamaica in the 16, of course, late 1650s after the conquest, and the throughout the 1660s, where a lot of naval forces were,
Hmm.
like Christopher Minks, for example, he hired
Yes.
depended heavily upon the Buccaneers. But I mean, you can kind of see how he was the opposite of the Pointee, where he came from more humble backgrounds himself. And
Hmm.
he also he had a bit of a Buccaneer personality himself, where he
Yeah.
got accused of hiding money and sharing it out with his men and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you can see how he had to adapt to the men under his command
Yeah. And he
and stuff
seemed
like
to have
that.
had much more unconventional attitude too. Let's
Yeah,
go in, let's do these quick raids, let's, get it
yeah.
done.
Looking at these men like Mings and later on Jamaica, where you have like the sort of English garrison and stuff like that cooperating and
Mhm.
joining the Buccaneers and stuff. One of the, of course, like the Buccaneers, on some occasions they were deployed like in, I mean, I can't keep track of all the Anglo-Dutch wars. I think it was the second one in the 1660s, where I think it was Charles Morgan that used some Buccaneers to take, I think it's Saba. It's one of those
Hmm.
tiny islands
Yeah. Hmm.
in the Lesser Antilles. But of course, one of the, so of course, they weren't like these cases where they did some occupation and conquest minor. But one of the biggest things, most important things they were able to use the Buccaneers for was reconnaissance and intelligence gathering and stuff like that. And a lot of times when, Modiford, Governor Modiford of Jamaica, who worked most closely with Henry Morgan, when he sent him out, he often just told him, like, gather intelligence, like, gather information about what are the Spanish doing, what are their strengths, their fortifications, everything. And of course, the Buccaneers were really good at this, like reconnaissance and
Yeah.
intelligence gathering and stuff like that. Could you go a bit more like deeper into that? What made the Buccaneers so good at this, like intelligence gathering and scouting and stuff like that?
First, it's anybody, any military operation, you want to stay alive, and the more you know about your target, the better you're going to be. They needed the intelligence because they wanted to know what was available, who was going to be where, what ships were going to be there when. And they did this through almost an informal network of contacts that they had on the Spanish Main, on Spanish territories. We know that Lawrence de Graaf was a Spaniard he dealt with on the north coast of Cuba regularly.
Hmm.
Because these people would trade, it's illicit trade, and that's the easiest way to get to them and talk to them. It's like, here, I'll
Yeah.
trade with you. What would you like? You talk to me, pay for them, buy the information. You don't always have to go ashore and torture somebody, although they did that as well at times. A lot of their intelligence collection seems to be more of establishing contacts in different places. There's Spanish, there's fishermen and turtle fishermen and locals, and there's a lot of trade, illicit trade that was going on in these coastlines, and that was one of the best ways to do it. You just check in with these traders and talk to them, and if that doesn't work, you just reach in and you grab some people off the beach and talk to them. If they won't talk, then you torture them. And again,
And
this was quite
just to
common.
pitch in there quickly, a lot of Buccaneers they also doubled as smugglers and armed traders and
Hmm.
stuff like that, conducting.
Yeah, they knew just pretty much everything. They knew where the Armado de Barlovento was, whatever it was. They knew where the treasure fleets were. They knew what ships were moving here and there. And like I said, it was a combination of extorted information and just information that they would just simply buy through established contacts. And it was not just Spanish who would get this information. The Dutch traded with the Spanish all the time, and you could go to
Yeah.
Dutch merchants as well and get the same information. And I don't know for true, but I would not be surprised that there wasn't an informal network of Dutch traders through Curacao and,
Oh
who
yeah.
were trading to some of the French and the British Islands and say, hey, we were just at this coastline, and selling the information or trading for the information as well. But, with modern technology, we all think that you have to have computers and telephones and the internet and everything to exchange information, but information even in those times passed pretty quickly.
And of course,
Very, very.
another one of the big benefits they had over, say, a conventional force was that they used light and very small ships that were, I mean, these kinds of ships in the regular navy naval forces were used specifically for scouting. A Buccaneer battleship like a frigate or a sloop
Mhm.
would, in the navy just be a scouting ship, for gathering
Yep.
intelligence. How do you think the intelligence gathering skills and scouting and reconnaissance skills of the Buccaneers compared to those of the Marines and the SEALs?
Well, there's probably differences in their order of magnitude because,
Mm.
Marines, if there's any significant size operation, they've got access to target folders that have been compiled by experts, people whose entire job is doing it. We're talking not just naval intelligence, the Marines have their own intelligence personnel. And a lot of this information could be derived from CIA reports, DIA, the National Security Agency in general. So you essentially they've got target folders that are put together with all of this information, often highly classified, but they will, pull the information out that's necessary tactically. So Buccaneers are doing their own intelligence gathering. It kind of reminds me of Navy SEAL platoons in Vietnam. They often did their own intelligence gathering themselves.
Mm.
They were small units operating in confined areas, and they did their own intelligence gathering in part because they did not trust uh, the larger intelligence organizations.
Mm.
They just didn't trust the information. They weren't sure if it was compromised information or what. They preferred to get their own. And so Buccaneers would kind of look like this, collecting and evaluating their own intelligence. Anyway, I think the major difference is Buccaneers are gathering and evaluating their own intelligence, whereas the Marines, they may be collecting intelligence, but that's always going to go back to somebody they're going to collect, well, I guess they're going to say they're going to collect information and somebody's going to evaluate it for intelligence.
Now that's a very good summary there. And to conclude there on the whole discussion, I'm firstly going to ask you, are there any things that you think Marines or other for armed forces today could learn from the Buccaneers?
Foremost, I still like the idea of officers setting the example and leading from the front. And in some small units, you're still going to have that. Special operations forces, that's generally still done. I've run across a couple where the officer is like, oh, I'm staying back at the ship and coordinating things. That was not the Navy. And I'm like, why aren't you supposed to be in the field? And I think in this case, I think it was a matter of people just his senior enlisted deciding that he'd be better off kept out of the way. But the idea of leading from the front, I think, is very valuable. Leading by example, but be willing to be out there at the front, calling the shots and risking as much as your own people do. And I understand that in a command and control structure, you can't always do that, especially as your officers, more the higher officer grades, they need to be able to coordinating the whole operation. They don't need to be up there firing an M16 on the front line. But still, the idea of officers leading from the front and exposing themselves to danger, I think, is important for troop morale and leadership and inspiration. And you do see a lot. I have to credit French aristocrats and other European aristocrats, even in the 17th century, for deliberately exposing themselves to enemy fire and even leading charges
Yeah.
at the times, to rally the troops and say, yeah, you're a peon, but, I'm still going to share some of the same risks as you do. And I think that's very, very, very important. The idea that you can be a little bit unconventional, that you can break the rules at times is important. Not just indiscriminately breaking the rules, but, tactics, you need to be able to think on your feet. And Buccaneers, I believe, were generally very, very good at that. One of the things I really liked about SEAL Team was that you not just had a high degree of teamwork, you were not going to make it through training if you could not work as a team. They did a psychological study one time and found that most of the people who quit training were what they called Rambos. They could score very high on risk taking, too high, in fact, but they were at the bottom when it came to teamwork.
Yeah.
They couldn't work with anybody else. And those are absolutely not the people you want around. And Buccaneers seem, at least when push came to shove, they may have been lousy seamen, lazy seamen, but in the field when they needed to be, they worked really well as a team. But they were also highly flexible and highly adaptable. You could change your plans. And some military organizations are a little too rigid. And you were alluding to that earlier. I think when we were talking about officers and the leadership roles and being able to, get out and think on and make decisions themselves. And that's very, very important. And if you have too much rigidity in that, I think we saw that in, Ukraine and Russia early
Mm.
on in the war. The Ukrainians very, very adaptive, very flexible. The Russian
Yeah.
forces initially absolutely were not. And that adaptability, the ability to, change as necessary, as the tactical environment changes and you be able to adapt and think on your feet and move it. And I enjoyed that in my time in the Navy. And because that was another thing that was emphasized very well. And the Buccaneers really, I think, understood this in a lot of ways. They could adapt their tactics and change things and they weren't so rigid as we got to charge, we got to attack the fortification this way. It's more like, well, that's not what we expected. Let's change our plan. And that's another distinction between the, conventional forces. A large conventional force would be like, well, too bad, we're going anyway,
Yeah.
because it's the mission. We got to take this town. So some of you guys prepare to die because, we lost the element of surprise. I do think there is a problem with powerful militaries, and I could criticize the U.S. military. And I know we had officers criticizing, at least back in the 80s and even the 90s, as I recall, is that sometimes they forget to use tactics. When you're too powerful, you think, well, we just have more bombs than they do. We'll just throw more bombs at them, and just keep doing it. You tend to forget tactics and thinking on your feet and adapting. And then there might be better ways to secure an obstacle than just overwhelming force. Historically, you've seen that too. Well, we've got more troops than they do. We'll just throw more troops. And if we lose 2,000 a day, who cares? Because we got lots.
Yeah.
When there might have been a better way, to take the target, spare your troops to die another day, that sort of thing. You need to be careful about, I'm trying to phrase this, how to figure out how to do it. You need to make sure you have the proper kind of discipline, but even when you have that discipline, you need to be able to tell your leaders that this is a bad idea.
Yeah.
Not just follow that cult of personality or let greed get in your way. It's the biggest thing I think is that the certain degree of indiscipline Buccaneers had at times. They seem to have been very disciplined right up through the assault itself and taking the target, but then that indiscipline would enter at that point, and discipline breaks down. They're vulnerable to counterattacks.
But I think with the discipline, you definitely need to sort people, like the ones you recruit. You need to ensure that you get people who are, you know, what are they, what motivates them? Why do they want to
Mhm,
get in there and do what they want to do? And I mean, uh, not only do you need officers who keep them in check, to make sure that everyone follows the rules of war, but you also need your comrades and your pair and the guy next to you. He also needs to say it
mhm.
like, dude, what the fuck are you doing? Stop doing this, or
Yeah.
you're not thinking right, or everyone needs to keep each other in check because you can see like stuff in like Ukraine right now, and in previous conflicts in Vietnam, of course, especially when armed forces get less and less professional and you mass recruit more conscription, things can easily spiral out of control, and not only can it lead to war crimes and stuff like that, but it can also lead to a breakdown of discipline, like
Mhm.
you say, and people are gonna die whether they
Well,
wear a uniform or
yeah,
not.
yeah, that's an excellent point. I think something, sorry, I was just watching what one of the cats is getting into. Um, we have this idea, and even I may have promoted it too much, or people haven't read, they read the main paragraph and not the following paragraphs, but not all Buccaneers were veteran disciplined fighters, and they recruited a lot of other people. You had
Yeah,
indentured servants and other people who were just running away, small planters who were failing, their farms were failing and things running away who had no
yeah,
military experience. The fact that you had so many Buccaneers on some of these who were running around barefoot with minimal arms and things, shows that they were not all a major discipline fighting force. And again, that's part of the problem that you just pointed out is that you don't always have the best people. If you need 1,000 men to sack a large city, you take what you can,
yeah,
and leave your veterans up front to hopefully provide the discipline and carry the day. But um, yeah, I don't think there was a Buccaneer formal training program. Before we go to sea, we're going to do all the drilling. It's kind of more of probably more ad hoc. We know there had to
yeah,
be training. You can't go to sea. You can't learn how to sail a ship. You can't learn how to navigate. You can't learn how to do a lot of things. You can't learn how to, fire a weapon properly and things if somebody's not there training you. So we do know there was a certain degree of discipline there, but yeah, the people are all over the place, and I
yeah,
think the quality of the personnel is all over the place as well. It'd also be interesting, is something you were talking about earlier, is language. If that ever led
yeah.
to any confusion on the battlefield, there are other problems in that.
No, and I think that wraps it up nicely. Obviously, and I think you probably noticed it as well. This is probably a topic which would require a lot of hours, and there's a lot to be said, but I think that should cover it for today at least. We have definitely covered a lot. So thank you again for showing up. This was a lot of fun, and I think a lot of people are gonna not only enjoy it, but I think there's a lot of use to be had in a discussion like this for armed forces, especially looking at the world right now, the state of the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for having me. Didn't want to get too political here. It's I guess it could be a completely separate political discussion going on.
And I think that something like that could be interesting as well, because there are definitely a lot of historical parallels and stuff you can draw. And
I was just reading Antonia Fraser's biography of Charles II, and then I read Peter Earle's of James II. I'm finishing up the annotations of Captain Blood, so I was going back
mm,
and reviewing some sources and things. But I was just
right,
amazed at the similarities then, just in the England and even in France and Europe at the time, and what's going on now, and
yeah,
um, just how quickly populations and people can change and political attitudes can change, and it's just like I said, I'm believe in democracy at heart, and I'm just not. It's the and I that's one of the things I appreciate about Buccaneers is that they were, they had this true form of democracy that's going, and it's kind of refreshing, even if it was in the service of plundering people who many of whom couldn't defend themselves. But
yeah.